there, this is Trisha and welcome back to my channel. Today I have several cards to share with you as I am participating in the final challenge for my Altenew Educator Certification Program. For this challenge, I've been asked to make his and hers sets of cards, and this video will feature the cards for her. If you want to check out my other video, you can see the set of cards that I made that are more masculine. For this beautiful set of feminine cards, you can see that I have chosen different products and different techniques for each card, so they do have their own identity. However, to keep them cohesive and to make it feel like a group, I've chosen this same accent color with this gray cardstock throughout the set, and I've kept a consistent color palette and general feel to all of the cards in this group. Let's go ahead and get started with card number 1, which is a thank you card. For this card, I am going to be using this Wispy Begonia stamp set. I'll use the floral image as well as the leaves, and I'm starting with an A2 panel of bright white watercolor paper, and I'm using the smooth side so that I get a good impression. I'm going to prep my cardstock with an anti-static tool, and then I'm stamping this in Versamark ink right in the corner there, hanging off the edge of the page. I'm going to sprinkle this image with clear embossing powder, and then I will rotate it and stamp it again in the opposite corner. Now I've set the embossing powder and I've got the paper back in my MISTI, and now I'm going to stamp a couple of leaves. And after I emboss those, I will pull out a mask, and you can see I've used this mask several times before, but that's okay as long as it still has some stick. I'm going to mask off my original flowers so that I can continue to build a little cluster around the edge of the page. I know it's hard to see on camera here, but I can see in real life, so I'm going to try to catch the light for you. It gets blown out for a second here, but I think you can see it if I hold it up. So I'm able to see where I'm going to be painting. So I have smooshed some of my dye inks over onto the right side of my glass mat, and I'm just going to use a small paintbrush and some water, and I'm going to be tapping in some color. And it works really great when you've got an embossed image because it sort of creates little wells and confines the color to each petal of the flower or each vein of the leaf. So it makes the watercoloring super easy. And I'm not going to do any, I'm not a fine artist. I'm not going to do anything real fancy here. I'm just tapping in some color. I've got some peaches, some yellows, some light pink, some dark pink, and it just makes the petals a little bit more interesting. And I'll work my way around this flower. I do try to put a little bit of darker color in the pit of the flower, like sort of the base where it will be closest to the center, and wherever a petal is behind another petal and might have some shadow on it. So that's about the only guideline I'm following. Otherwise, I'm just putting in some color and letting the water do its thing. Since I am doing several cards today, I'm not going to walk you through this entire process. I'll skip ahead, and you can see I've colored all of those blooms and the leaves as well, and just used some peaches, pinks, and bright greens to stick with my color palette for this card set. And this creates a beautiful frame around the outside of my card. To add a little extra interest in that white area in the center, I am tapping some splatters. For my sentiment, I have stamped "Your kindness is appreciated" on a piece of gray cardstock, and I'm going to emboss that. I stamped it in black onyx ink, and then I'll just add some clear embossing powder, and that makes the sentiment nice and shiny and makes it stick out beautifully. And I'm going to cut a little banner shape into one end of my sentiment strip. In order to leave some of that gray showing all around, I do need to trim my floral panel down just a tiny bit. And then I'll pop the sentiment up with some foam tape And then I'll use my ATG gun and apply lots of adhesive since I did a lot of watercoloring on this watercolor paper. And I'm just going to center that on this piece of gray cardstock. For a finishing touch, I'm going to add just a couple of pearls that are self-adhesive and sprinkle those around the page. And that just adds a little bit of bling, catches your eye, and finishes off the card. Pretty little detail. Here are a few still shots of the completed card. All I did was mount it to an A2 card base. So let's start with card number 2, which is a birthday card. This card has a little bit more of a whimsical design, maybe a little less romantic looking, but I'm going to use an A2 Neenah Solar White card base, and I'm just taping that down to my glass mat here, and then I'm bringing in this Scallop Builder stencil, and you can see I've got tons of Post-it tape all over it because I was practicing where I was going to do my inking. So I'm just masking off one stripe, if you will, of scallops, and then I am going to apply some color with my ink blending tool. And again, I'm sticking with pinks, peaches, a little bit of pale yellow, just staying with that same color family. And I'm just going to gently apply that through the stencil to create one line of scallops running up the page. Once I have my first row done, then I can shift the stencil over and line it up so that it nestles right in next to the other inked section. And I do have to, when I shift it, I have to go down a little bit, so I do have to mask off the top and then slide the whole thing up a little so that I can complete the row, because these scallops end up being staggered, so you do have to shift them up and down. So after I've done a couple rows, I'm going to put one more piece of Post-it tape on my card panel and mask off a straight line so that my final stencil inking, like the final ink that I apply, will be have a clean edge on the right side. So you'll see what I'm talking about in a second here, but I'm going to go ahead and ink up the last color, which I believe is Fresh Peach. And then when I peel off that piece of Post-it tape, you can see it gives me a nice, just straight, clean edge down the center. So to set off that edge, I am going to add a strip of gray cardstock. And you'll see throughout this whole set of cards, I'm going to continue to use that same gray accent color. Now to add a sentiment, I went into my stash and I found this Happy Birthday sentiment die. I think this is from Pink Fresh Studio. And they have this super fine little Happy Birthday sentiment. And because it's so fine, I lined some black cardstock with Stick-It adhesive and then did the die cutting. And that way I could get this teeny, really thin sentiment die cut to adhere well. So I'm just peeling off that release paper, and then I'm using my pokey tool to kind of line up where I want that and setting the happy birthday sentiment off to one side. So I'll put some fun foam behind that panel and mount it on a piece of gray cardstock, and then I will use a Wink of Stella pen to add just a little bit of shimmer to those large arches. And this is just a very subtle touch, but it adds a whole lot to the card. It just catches the light when you lift the card up and move it around, and I'm going to try to show it to you here so you can see how much glitter that adds. And you can also see I added 3 little gems next to the word birthday. So here are a couple of still shots so you can get a closer look, and that completes my second card. Okay, on to card number 3. This is perfect for any occasion when you just want to say hello to a friend. And I'm going to start with the Wonderland stamp set. And I have a large piece of Neenah Solar White in my MISTI here. And I'm just going to situate that large floral in the corner. And I'm just going to ink out up just the top, not the stem. I'm not going to be needing the stem for this design. So I'm just using VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And I'm getting a nice crisp impression there with my MISTI. I'll rotate my paper and stamp that again. Then I am going to pull in the leaves from the Wispy Begonia set. There aren't really leaves per se in the Wonderland set, and I wanted some large leaves with the same open space like the bloom has. So I'm just stamping a couple of those on the same page. And then the technique that I'm going to use to color these is to use my inks with a blending tool. So this is a Tombow blending brush. I believe Dove also makes one of these, and you can get them from Stampin' Up. But I'm just going to use this blending pen, which works like a marker, and you use it to pick up ink from your from a palette or from your ink lid or whatever you want to use, and then apply it to your page kind of like a marker. I do not need to use watercolor paper for this. I'm just using my Neenah Solar White, but you do kind of have to be a little aware that you don't overwork or oversaturate the paper so that it pills up. So you can see I've got a piece of scratch paper off to the left there, and I'm just using my marker to pick up a little of that peach that I put on my glass mat. And then my other ink pads have some ink right in the lid, so I don't even need to put them on the glass mat. But I'm picking it up and then spreading it out with the blending pen, and the more strokes, the more it fades away. So it starts pretty intense and then it blends out to nothing. And it gives me this really pretty loose watercolory look, kind of painterly. This isn't a very realistic looking coloring job. It's just kind of adding some pretty color. You can see I'm changing up the colors within the petals. I just like the way that this is a very, I don't know, ethereal looking kind of bloom here. And what I'm using that scratch paper for is between switching colors, I can rub the tip of the blender pen over on the scratch paper and just get any excess ink off of it so that I don't contaminate my other inks when I go from dark to light. So I'm just working my way around the flower here, and you can see this goes really fast. It is very easy to get color down, and I'm making the color a little bit more intense towards the center of the bloom, and just enjoying playing with all of these beautiful colors. So I've done this process for both blooms and the 3 leaves, and I'm using the same color palette, that kind of bright bamboo green and all these peaches and pinks. And then I'm going to fussy cut these out right up against the edge of the stamp. And as try as I might, I can never get that perfect. So to cover that up, I just run a black brush pen along the edge of my cut image, and it makes it look like you cut perfectly along the line. It just sort of covers up that edge and cleans it up. It's a really big difference when you do that. It seems like a simple step, but try it if you haven't done that before. So I used that fancy Hello die a second ago, and I just cut that from some yellow cardstock, pale yellow cardstock. And now I'm arranging my petals, and I'm kind of taking the 2 blooms and lining them up together to make it look like they're one big flower. And again, this is not realistic. I don't know that there's a flower in nature that really looks like this, but I just thought they came together really pretty, and it just kind of stretches your stamps. Instead of having the having it look the way that the stamp set was originally intended, you can get an entirely different looking flower from it. So I'm using foam tape in some spots, liquid glue in some spots, so that I get some dimension and some lift on some of these elements. And I'm mounting all of this to just a piece of Neenah Solar White cardstock. And then I'm going to stack that yellow Hello die cut with several layers of cardstock behind it, just to kind of thicken it up, give it some dimension and some weight. Then I'll put this entire panel onto a gray background, and you're noticing a theme here. I'm using that gray throughout all these cards, and it does tie them all together. I'm running my little pokey tool along the edges of these die cuts just to make sure that I have them lined up right and that I don't have any little fuzzies or bits of glue oozing out the side. And then I will use my Tombow Mono Multi-Glue to tap on some dots of glue all over the entire die cut and add it to the bottom corner of the card. It's always good when you're using liquid glue to put something heavy on there and let it dry. I have found these big, giant gems in my stash, and I just thought that would make the perfect flower center and add that touch of bling without overdoing it. And then that will complete my card. I'll just mount it to this top folding A2 card base. And I have this beautiful finished product. I just think it's such a bright, cheery way to send a hello to someone. Let's jump into card number 4. For this card, I'm going to be coloring an outline image again, and these images are from the Delicate Primrose set. And I'm just going to select that one kind of front-facing outline stamp. I'm prepping my cardstock, and then I'll be stamping this in Versamark ink repeatedly, kind of creating a vertical arrangement down the left side of the page. So I'll hit these with white embossing powder, give it a little tap, and heat it to set it. Once they're set, I will use these masks, and one of the masks is the right mask for this flower, and the other masks, I'm just sort of faking it and just covering up the one edge. I don't need it to be perfect all the way around the flower. And then I'm taking the open leaf image, and I will stamp that in some Versamark behind my flowers to sort of connect the clusters. I will emboss those, heat them to set them, and then I have this beautiful arrangement of flowers down the side of my card. And I am going to color these with colored pencils, and again I'm sticking with peach, pink, yellows, and then some bright greens for the leaves. And I'm using a fair amount of white here too. I want these to be pretty pale, pretty muted, and I'm using the white as a base for the petals, and then I'm also kind of using the white again to blend my colors together. And just working my way around, trying to imagine where there might be some folds or shadows in the petals. But again, I am not an expert colorist by any means, so I'm just having fun with this and enjoying the relaxation of coloring with colored pencils. I've got a lot to do here, and this does end up taking a little while, so I'm not going to make you watch all of it. I'll skip ahead. So here's what the card looks like as I'm finishing up. I've got some of that bright color laid down. Again, this is not what I would call any sort of professional or fine art coloring. I just had a lot of fun with this and just putting in some variations of colors on all the petals to keep it interesting and adding layers. Everybody that I've watched on YouTube says that you're supposed to start with just soft layers and build them up. So that's what I tried to do here. For my sentiment, I want to run a strip of vellum. I don't want to cover up all this coloring that I've done, so I want to run a strip of vellum across the bottom of the page and then just have my sentiment just slightly overlap the coloring down there. So this is going to just simply say thanks, and I believe this comes from that Wispy Begonia set. And I used my card and the vellum in the MISTI together to just sort of help me figure out where I wanted that placed. And then I can trim the vellum down into a strip after I have heat set it. And you can see I'm going at this carefully, making sure I have a good hot heat gun so I don't warp that vellum. So I'm going to use my trimmer, trim that down into a strip that I can run across my page. And I want that strip to be wider than my page so that I can wrap it behind the page and adhere it in the back. And then I don't have to worry about seeing any adhesive through the vellum. So I'm really happy with how that looks. Just for a finishing touch, I'm grabbing 2 colors of Nuvo drops. I'm using whites for the centers of the flowers and just sort of playing around with some other little dots in various sizes around the card, just to add a little movement and a little interest. So that will finish up my design. All I need to do is mount this to a card base. Here's a closer look so you can see that coloring that I did with the colored pencils, and look at how that vellum strip lays right over the top without distracting. And I was pretty pleased with how that one turned out. For my fifth card, I created a sympathy card. I started off with the Layered Floral Cover Die A. I don't even have the other one. I just bought this one on its own. And I'm cutting out that whole floral frame, and you can see that off to the left. And then I have another piece of A2 cardstock that I am going to ink up just using my mini ink blending tools. So I'm starting with a peachy color. I think this is Peach Perfect, Perfect Peach. And I'm just lightly applying this. If you don't have a lot of experience with ink blending tools, just a little tap onto your ink pad, and then start off the surface of the paper and work your way on with a light hand. It's always better to build color up rather than start really dark, and that way you get a little bit of a smoother look. So the key is to have patience and take your time so that you don't get any big blotches. Once I've got that peach laid down, I'm moving on to a pink color, and I'm paying attention to where the flowers are on that die, and I'm building up some pink areas that are going to be behind the flowers. So you can see I'm identifying where those are going to go, and I'm trying to extend the pink so that it goes out to the edges of the petals of those flowers and leave the true peach in between them. And I just keep referencing that cover die and lining it up just to make sure that I've got that color where I want it. Then I'll move on to a brighter pink, and I'm going to mark where I feel the center of those flowers will be and put a little dot there. Now I know, we all try to make our ink blending very smooth, and this is not, but I know it's going to be covered up by a lot of that dye, so I wasn't too concerned. And since I wasn't working from the edge of the page, I did get a big mark from my ink blending tool. But I wanted to create this circle of, it's sort of blended out, but it's sort of concentrated there. I wanted to create a circle of color that would represent the center of that flower and give it some depth, and then by the edges of the petals, it should be out to that lighter pink, and then in between the flowers, leaving it peach. I hope I'm making sense how I'm describing that. But you can see here, it looks a little bit like a hot mess when you just show the ink panel, but then when you put that cover die in front of it, all of a sudden it starts to make sense, and those flowers kind of pop out from the cover die. For my sentiment, I'm going back to that gray cardstock once again, and I am going to heat emboss Heartfelt Condolences. This is from that Delicate Primrose set that I used earlier, and I'm just doing this on a strip of that gray cardstock, leaving it long enough so that I can shift it and figure out the best placement once I've got everything assembled. So I'm going to go ahead and adhere that cover die to my inked panel, and then adhere the sentiment strip with some foam tape, and then cut off the excess with my long scissors. I found a tiny little heart stamp from my stash, and I'm just kind of blending two different colors of ink, the same inks from my background, and stamping that heart, and I'll fussy cut it out and add it as a little embellishment right next to my sentiment. And I think that adds just like a nice finishing touch. I'll put some Wink of Stella glitter on there, and finally I will cover it with glossy accents that I have in this fine tip applicator bottle. And this will look kind of milky at first, but it'll dry perfectly clear, and it'll look like almost like a little epoxy embellishment. And that will complete my card. Once again, I'll mount this on an A2 card base, and you can get a closer look in these still shots of my finished card. So my final card is a Miss You card. I had my friends on the West Coast in mind when I made this card. I am using the Layered Laurel set from All to New, and I'm lining up the smaller of the two sprigs. If you're not familiar with this set, it has multiple layers of leaves to create a really full cluster. So I'm starting with just sort of the skimpiest one and stamping it in that dark pink ink, and then rotating and stamping again. And then for the next layer, I'll shift to a slightly lighter pink ink, line everything up so that it looks like the leaves are coming right off that stem. And I'm getting 2 stamps for every time I place them because I am rotating my cardstock. Then I'll move on to peach ink for yet another layer. You can see these images are starting to look more and more full and lush. And then my final layer is with a pale yellow ink. And they really have this beautiful layered dimensional result. Now I'll do the same process with the larger layered laurel leaf. And I'm just kind of coming in from the other end of the page. And this time I'll rotate my paper 180 degrees vertically. And I'll stamp all of those just like I did the first so that I've got these really full images. And then I'm going to sort of fill in my gaps. I'm going to take the smaller one and fill in the little corners there and repeat the whole process. I'm going to come in one last time with that large leaf again right down the center and fill in the middle. And once I've got all the layers stamped, you can see my final result. Now this is a pretty busy looking background as it sits right now. All those colors against the stark white are definitely pretty busy. So to tone that back and push those flowers into the background a little bit more, I am going to ink right over the top of them all around the outside of my panel. So I'm taking my lighter pink ink from the palette that I've been using throughout this whole card set, and I'm just using my mini ink blending tool and lightly applying ink around the outside edge. And you can see it starts to mute that design a little bit so it's not so in your face. And then I'm going to take that peach ink and very carefully blend that into the center. Now, if you're going to start in the middle of your paper and not come in off the edge, you really need to start with a soft touch so you don't get those harsh blender foam lines. So I'm really starting soft and just building up some color little at a time to get that peach in the middle. Then finally, I'm going to blend the peach into the pink with another little swipe of that light pink in, and then I will move to an even darker pink and just touch the tips of the paper all the way around to kind of frame it out. So I'm much happier with the background once I've inked it. Now I'm going to go back to this Friend die that I also used in my masculine set, and I'm going to die cut it 3 times with some white cardstock, and I will stack these 3 die cuts to create a focal point across the center of the card. Pulling out my trusty gray cardstock again, and I am just kind of arranging where I want that to sit on my card and how I want the sentiment to read. And the stamped portion of my sentiment says "Missing You," and it's just a really tiny, fine stamp. And I'm going to white heat emboss that on the gray cardstock using my ultrafine heat embossing powder. I'll heat that to set it, and then that will fit right in with that Friend die cut, so that ultimately my card will say "Missing You, Friend." You can see how that works. So I'm going to adhere the Friend die cut, all 3 of those that I've stacked together, right onto the gray cardstock. Let that set up, and then I can take the entire piece off and put some foam tape across the back of that gray cardstock, load it all up with foam tape, even some tiny slivers of it on the backs of those letters, and then I can place that on my inked background. So I'm really happy with how that turned out. I can just trim off the excess with my scissors, anything that's hanging off the side. And now that beautiful background that we made, it feels a little bit more subtle, and we've pulled the sentiment in to be our focal point. I'm grabbing a couple of those pearls and sprinkling those around the card just for a touch of bling to catch the eye. And I'll use my ATG tape runner to adhere this to a side folding A2 card. That is going to do it for my sixth and final card in this set. I really love how pretty this turned out with all these peaches and pinks in the background. And I thought I'd give you a look at all of the cards together here so you can see them as a set again. And I really want to thank you for sticking with me through a very long video today. I hope that it was worth it for you and you picked up some inspiration along the way. I certainly enjoyed this challenge and had so much fun making all of these cards for my Altenew courses. Thanks everybody. I'm so happy to have you here. Hit subscribe if you'd like to see more from me, and I hope you have a wonderful day.